Welcome to the first Backstage session of 2024. We are super happy to have you here, myself and Karen Stone with us today. And this is our first Backstage session with none other than a very relevant topic for everyone: how to design brain-friendly learning that is lasting impact. So we will deep dive a bit into some neuroscience principles that you can apply, and Karen will share as well her lessons learned on how you can make sure that your learning initiatives are having an impact in the long term. And good news, we were able to make some final adjustments to be able to record the session for you. So you may have noticed it is being recorded. So if at the end you want to have a look into something or share it with someone else, feel free to do so. So without further ado, Karen, over to you.
Thanks so much for the intro, Anna. And I'm really delighted to be here, especially as it is the first of the year. And so I think that sense of, okay, how can we set ourselves up as learning and development professionals for a great year ahead? And so I'm going to share with you a little bit about my personal story about why I founded my business and the work that I do, the principles behind it a little bit, the difference I believe that how I design and create solutions really tangibly moves the needle. And then I'm going to dive into a case study with a client of mine, giving you the approach and 4 key pillars. When you signed up, you'll see that we sort of designed that or divided that into 4 sections. So I'm going to go into what I did to create the outcomes for the client. And then there's going to be about a 15-minute period at the end for your questions. So I know Anna's going to keep an eye on the chat. So please do have your questions. I think it's what makes these sessions richer and more valuable to everybody, all of you as practitioners yourselves. So I'm going to get going. So I founded Mindshift Performance, having been for the last 10 years in in-house corporate roles, predominantly in tech organizations in SaaS, primarily heading up global learning, leadership, and talent teams. And I guess the pain points and the frustrations that I experienced drove me to, as I decided to transition into my own business, what was I really passionate about? What did I care about? And what did I find were the common challenges that my colleagues and peers were experiencing that I really wanted to make a difference in? And I know it's top of all of your agendas for this lasting impact, that we want to be associated for our personal, professional, and functional credibility with how we connect the interventions that we're developing, delivering, facilitating, or being a conduit for, that it's actually we're able to demonstrate in some term an ROI, a benefit, an impact, and that impact needing to be a performance impact. So how does it move the needle on performance for the organization? And so that's what I really care about. I've always cared about it. Prior to being in my in-house roles, I worked as a consultant globally in the areas of culture change and leadership for 10 years, working with lots of big organizations who are going through merger and acquisitions. So working with the exec teams there around aligning a sort of a fit for future culture, especially after an M&A type situation, but also just to help equip leaders with sort of leading edge skills to help improve performance, increase engagement and retention, and really to be a talent attractor as a brand. So I thought I would just highlight some statistics which I'm sure resonate with everybody here, and that we've either experienced the pain, the frustration, or the opportunity of. I've drawn the research from 3 different areas. So the first one, it's only about 25% of learners who are able to successfully translate something from a learning environment into their job role. And that's come from some Burson research. And then something from Boulevard, which is saying that only 15 to 20% of the time, once the learner returns back to their work environment and routine, are they able to deliver that impact, that change that they want into their day jobs? And then this, I guess, embedding of learning. So after 1 week, the knowledge reduces by half, and that reduces to only 10% retention after 3 months post some sort of intervention or program. Now, I'm not saying those statistics aren't known to you, but I think it sets a bit of context for the session that I want to cover with you today. So they're things that we struggle and have pain with. And one of the things that I feel that as practitioners we have struggled a little bit with is this top point, which we're using. When I say old-fashioned, I'm not trying to be detrimental when I say that, but science has moved on so much in the last 5 years even, that we're still trying to deploy old world solutions to solve current and future day problems. And that's not because in any way that we aren't prioritizing trying to keep up to date, but the pace of change and the volume of deliverables that we are charged with makes that difficult to stay up to date with it changing so quickly and with such a toughly packed agenda of priorities that we're trying to juggle. And so I decided, having got into neuroscience in a bit of a geeky way, probably about 10 years ago, when it was still quite new and quite academic. What I mean by that was when I was reading and learning more, there was very little about how it applies in a corporate setting. And so I was having to try and make the connections myself for how does this insight, this piece of research, connect to the work that I'm doing. Now that's evolved since then. And so I've decided that my work will bring together the neuroscience itself, so understanding how our brains work, with the behavioral science about what are the things that influence what happens in our brain and how that results in what we do, so our behavior. And then thirdly, how do we put those two into practice to help ourselves? And that's really obviously where we need to start, even if we are responsible for helping for that in an organizational context, to help ourselves and others do better, perform better, be more successful, and do that in a way where we can feel satisfied that we're doing a good job. Can I just ask for any thumbs up or waves that this is making sense? I can't see all of you on screen, but just that it's landing. Okay, thanks. I can see Jessamine, Kimberly. Appreciate that. So, this is really the approach that, again, based on my personal experience, that I built the Mindshift Performance approach around. First, that we would use brain-centered solutions. And of course, that requires almost a weekly updating when that research comes out, of staying at that cutting edge of sort of science-backed, but practical and pragmatic solutions. And we know that most learning interventions by themselves solely don't actually change behavior. And so that's why in the solution, as you'll see as I share my case study example today, how we've done that with leaders and participants with the skills to create sustainable change for themselves. So I'm having worked as a consultant and worked with some of the big consultants. It's often the case, and I'm sure it resonates with you, that we engage with a consultant often at very high cost, financial cost, and that whilst once they're working with us, might be feeling like we're building momentum and we're making progress, once the consultant leaves the project, oftentimes we come to a stop and then we start to revert back. And therefore, it's a challenge, I think, to convince somebody to invest their precious budget on something that they're maybe unable in the future to say, hand on heart, this works. it did achieve what we were setting out to achieve. And so with that brain sensor solution, I also wanted to be able to demonstrate this measurable impact. So in my last in-house role, we were working to design a solution, working with our data analytics team to see how we could connect performance data with an intervention. Whilst we recognize that it might not be 1 + 1 = 2, that there were contributory factors, that there was a way of showing that there was a connection to this approach and those changing results. And I'm singularly uninterested in smiley sheets as a data point. I recognize that we still use it a lot. And I think as a facilitator, it's affirming to know that the learning has landed. It's been a positive experience, that overall the environment was good, the tools, it was felt valuable in the moment. But that is just a snapshot of a moment in time. And it really doesn't translate into whether anything then happens as a result. And whilst I might be showing my age in saying, I remember being in workshops where you would be there for a week or more sometimes, and you would have a massive folder that was literally, you could hardly lift it up, and you bring it back to your desk and you'd stick it up on somewhere on your desk or on a shelf, and you never look at it again, even though you might have come out of that experience like really excited and feeling it was a really positive learning experience. So if smiley sheets aren't what matter, what are, is maybe a question we ask ourselves. And then the third point is, well, maybe shooting myself in the foot a little bit here, but as a consultant, I've decided that I only want to work with organizations and with stakeholders who recognize that actually the hard work happens inside their organization. You cannot outsource behavior change to an external provider or consultant. I believe it's the consultant's job to help the organization build that capability in-house. So the tools that I provide are context-free with regards to change, so that they can continually rerun this process or system with changing contexts. And therefore, when something else changes, which it will tomorrow or next week, either internally inside the organization or externally in that environment, but they will have the skills to adapt and deploy this change methodology in an ongoing way. So one of the things that I decided to do, I have studied a bit with the Neuroleadership Institute. For those of you that know that, I really value David Rock's work. But I discovered probably about nearly 2 years ago, I came across this book called The Habit Mechanics. It's a fantastic book, and it's good. This is the book. It's another one of those heavy tomes, and it scared me a bit with how big it was. However, I then met with the professor, Dr. John Finn, who wrote the book, and I decided to study with him to become a certified chief habit mechanic coach. And so I then I'm now certified that I can build habit mechanics inside organizations and use his methodologies. And what I really liked about his approach was he took something very complex, described in scientific terms. He's made it meaningful in a language that we can all relate to. And then he's applied it to personal, individual, team, and organizational change. And so I very much like the approach, and I will be sharing some of the tools from his methodology as well as my own experience with you today. So for me, behavior change, and we think about that as a learning professional, it has science in it. If it doesn't, then it's probably not working. It's also a practice for us as practitioners, also for our learners. That practice then needs to translate into an ongoing habit, and then we start to create these fantastic learning cultures. And this quote here, I think, is quite telling as well. So knowing that one is always capable of change making the decision to change it. So that, sorry, I can see that maybe it's not showing the whole quote maybe on your slide, although it is on mine. So I'll read it to you just in case that's true. So knowing that that one is always capable of change, the second step lies in making the decision to change. Change does not occur by merely willing it to, any more than behavior changes simply through insight. We know that we're typically or have worked previously in this area of knowledge, whether that's knowledge to inform people about a skill that they need to update themselves on. And yet, we often give more knowledge if it hasn't landed. And we're constantly in this sort of knowledge continuum. But we have to recognize that knowledge doesn't change behavior. Right? If you think about a packet of cigarettes, everything stamped around that packet of cigarettes tells you how bad it is for your health, and yet people still smoke. So facts don't change behavior. We need to lean in more to understand really what does, and then how do we build solutions that makes that live and brings it into life. So this might be a little bit provocative, but what I'm suggesting is if your approach isn't rooted somehow in science and built around habits, it won't fly. And what I mean by that is this idea of habits. I just want to, maybe you could give me a response into the chat. Maybe, Anna, if you could just summarize the continuum of answers that we get. Give me your best guess on how much of what we do is run unconsciously by our habits. So a percentage, if you could just share your thoughts in the chat. I'm curious to know what you think.
Okay, we have many bets here from 70 to 90%. Okay, no, lowest was 60. I saw 60 there.
Okay.
Highest, I hope I didn't miss anyone. Yeah, okay, 60 to 95. So
okay.
wide range, I would say,
a wide
Karen.
continuum. So you may be surprised to know that this figure, and it's a science-backed figure, is at least 98% of what we do, what we think, or what we feel, because our habits are emotional, they're thinking habits, and their doing habits is run by our habits. And that's because when we understand how our brain works, its primary function is to be efficient. And therefore, it makes sense that it creates shortcuts to conserve energy. Our brain accounts for about 3 to 4% of our body mass, but it requires 25% of the available energy to run effectively. And therefore, it makes sense that to run with that level of energy consumption is going to make lots of rules of thumbs and generalizations to help us function. So how do we then take a transition or a journey from providing knowledge and information, translate that into a skill and a practice, and then turn that into a habit that sustains itself? So, for example, I suspect it was a long time ago when you had to think consciously about tying a shoelace on a shoe. And yet I bet you remember as a child what a significant moment that was when you actually did it, because there was lots of practice and pain, and maybe your parents were there helping you and you were trying really hard. And then eventually you got it. It still required quite a lot of conscious effort for a while. Maybe you had your tongue out here as you were trying it hard. And then, of course, now we don't think about it at all. We just do it. And so I really like this quote from William James, who said his experience of the world is what is in the habit of attending to or doing. Therefore, we are what we practice. So every time we practice something, I'm sure you'll be familiar with the term neuroplasticity. It then builds stronger neural pathways. And so if I practice, for example, thinking negatively in a general sense, I'm going to get very, very good at that. and I'll do it more. And so we do have the capability to change because of this neuroplasticity in our brain. And so we have to be able to know the tools available to us to change from something that's pretty unhelpful, negative thinking, we'll do it, but it's not a helpful place to be, into something that's more helpful. So how do we get rid of outdated or unhelpful habits and replace them with helpful ones? And so just say that the foundation of any strategy is people's habits. And yet rarely do we think about strategy and tie that to habits, how we need people to behave. And so that's how I start my consulting conversation. So I'm going to share with you now. I'm not sharing the name of the company, but it is a fairly large global tech organization. And I was working with the finance and the IT directors and their teams directly. So the first level is clearly where you sort of do the consultation and start to think about how you're going to design solutions. And, you know, step one is I'm working with this client because they want behavior change. And so the issue that they articulated was that their line manager population, who had been subject matter expert, they'd been finance or IT experts, but now had people management roles, they needed to become more accountable as people managers and move away from their subject matter expertise, where obviously their comfort was. And so as we dove into that a little bit more closely, what I first wanted to understand was, well, what does accountability look like and what does it mean to you? Because if we all answered that question, we'd all probably have a different description. And so what did it mean to them? And then the second area was to how we'll know when we have more accountable managers. So what's the evidence of that? And then what are the habits that we need to help them create that's going to build that accountability approach? And so that's where we looked at the behaviors, we looked at the evidence, which is obviously going to help us then when we think about measurability. And then how do we design for the particular habits? And this is where we took the headline of accountability. So I challenged them to brainstorm all the things that they thought fitted under that accountability heading. Then we started to root that down because I told them they couldn't have more than 3. And the rule of 3, I think, is really relevant because we often try and do many things in a complex way. And yet the capacity we have to focus on multiple things when so much of our day job is so busy and consuming, that's often why we don't land something, because we aren't simplifying it enough down to a common and no more than 3. That's my rule. And so these 3 were the areas that they articulated were the ones that they really wanted to embed when they thought about accountability. So that's what we did. We designed a journey. If you remember back to that first slide when I was talking about the Mindshift Performance approach, it has to be a journey. It's not about a workshop. That will never highlight the real change. So we started with this group who were probably lacking quite a lot of self-insight about themselves. We started with a strengths assessment. I use a particular tool. This assessment not only assesses or helps them understand their strengths, but also their values and career drivers. And then we built in a one-to-one coaching session for them to understand and unpick that insight and then build some outcomes for themselves before going into a workshop experience. And I'm going to talk more about the workshop in a moment, but they were designed to be brain friendly and give them the behavior change tools so that they could operate firstly on themselves, and secondly, in how they help their teams help create sustainable change. There was then quite a lot of support ad hoc from me, where I was sending them more things, not in a high volume way, but something to remind them, an article that I'd read, a short video to watch, a question that they could ask, while they were also providing me feedback and insight. And then we began a coaching intervention where they would meet with me, or they're still meeting with me. We haven't finished this intervention yet, once a month, where they would have a dedicated time with me. And that was enabled me to understand where they were at and where they were still struggling, but also then to hear their feedback about what was working and how they were using the tools. And I knew that it was landing well when I started to hear the personal stories where they were able to use it with their partner and with their kids. And so I could really see that they were taking something that, was classroom based, where we've been talking quite team level, into their way of operating. And that, really warmed my heart. And then we moved into the idea of how we do reinforce that in follow-up sessions. I just want to call out this idea of standards, because I know we're very, very focused on goals inside organizations. And whilst I'm not saying we shouldn't have goals, we focus too much on those things without actually building a system and a process that then leads us to the goal. It's almost like, let's set a goal and then set it aside and focus on the thing that's going to move us towards that goal. And I think standards is a really helpful way. And I'm going to give you a personal example. So outside of my corporate life, I'm a martial arts. I teach and practice a martial art, peaceful martial art. I'm a yoga teacher and breathwork coach, and I run wellbeing retreats. We just had one yesterday. And what I know about that is, for my own well-being habits, I've read the research, and I believe that cold water immersion is a great way to support your well-being. So I have a daily practice of a cold shower. The last minute of my shower is I turn it to cold. And that's one of my daily standards. And some days I don't feel like having a cold shower, but I tell myself, this is something that, it's not rocket science. It's not a thing that I've got to do for 3 hours. I've not got to go and stand in an ice bath for 3 hours. It's a simple thing. It's accessible and available to me. I'm in the shower anyway, and I'm going to hold myself accountable for that standard. So can you see how standards might be a useful way of helping people to set their personal standards around change? I have some slides here that I'm not going to spend lots of time on, because I want to make sure that we've got time for those questions that you may have at the end. But I am going to give you a couple of principles around the neuroscience guide, which is what I gave to the people in the workshop environment. So firstly, we are motivated as human beings either away from a threat or towards an outcome. And our brains are built to help us survive, and therefore the away from the threat response is much stronger, much faster, and much more immediate than moving somebody towards a goal. And that was designed to keep us safe and well. So, okay, wanting to find food is important for our survival, but it's not quite as critical as running away from that woolly mammoth that's standing right in front of us. So, I think that brain friendly is important when we think about how we create the environment for people to feel safe and for people to change. Because oftentimes, again, this is a research fact, that uncertainty is more threatening than actually knowing about a change. So an actual threat. Uncertainty is a more powerful threat response than an actual threat itself. Human beings hate uncertainty. And yet, a lot of the times that change is happening inside organizations, we don't know, we're not being communicated with as to what it means to me. We might have a headline, but we don't know exactly how it's going to affect me and my role. And so our brains are designed to be perception machines. They are constantly scanning our environment. Estimates are somewhere between 5 and 8 times every second, our brain is scanning our environment to see that it's going to say if there isn't a threat there that we need to do something about. So it's designed to keep us alive. It's an efficiency optimizer, as I said before. It wants to conserve energy, and it's also a social seeker. So it cares about what other people think about us. And so you can see all the ways that our brain is being primed for this threat response, and how unintentionally often, we set up this threat response by the way that we communicate or create an environment where we want to help people change. The good news is that if that happens in our limbic brain, where our emotions are processed and experienced, our prefrontal cortex, our further developed brain, can coach our what we call an ape brain here, so that alive perceived energy brain, so our limbic brain. And that's where a lot of the tools and the resources in the habit mechanic come from, is to help coach our brains to make wiser decisions and help change happen. So there's a habit loop. Some of you might be familiar with Charles Duhigg's work on the habits. This just adds in this ape incentive to that loop by saying we need to factor in those brain tendencies as we're designing new habits or wanting to get rid of old ones. There are 9 elements in there, which we just consider to be levers for change. They might not all be needed at the same time, but when I build solutions, I'm usually pulling all of those in. And again, I know the slide's a bit small. I'll happily share those with you if you put me a note afterwards. So that's the starting point of consulting and designing a solution. The other area that I find is key, and I've often found working inside organizations, is that managers, people managers, are not held accountable for the absolutely pivotal, critical role that they play in helping their learners and their teams embed their learning. So they will outsource learning to the L&D team or some version of that. And they're rarely playing a role, sometimes not at all. It never even gets discussed. You know, you may have been out of the business for a day, half a day, 3 days, and it never gets discussed and brought back into those leadership conversations. And so here we wanted to address in this solution how we keep the practice alive. And so what we did is I provided the tools in terms of a coaching guide that led the leader of the participants, so the leader of the leaders in this case, to guide them through a conversation to help them build these habits and embed them. And they were then involved in accountability sessions at the end of the workshop where they were invited in for the participants to share the habits that they were committing to build on, that they could then pick up in post-program in their one-to-ones with them. And then I was supporting the stakeholder leaders with the ad hoc challenges that they had around coaching and helping them to role model the behaviors that they'd identified that they wanted from their teams. Clearly, we were also designing for this measurability, and we wanted them to be able to show that there was a return on investment, both from the financial and the time invested in this intervention. And so we did that in a series of ways. There was hard and soft measures, absolutely. And we decided on those before I went into design mode. And so we knew that we were going to pick up anecdotal measures through feedback, through surveys, and via the coaching conversations that I and the stakeholder leaders would be having with the participants. But we're also planning to use the 360, and that would include direct feedback from the teams of the people who are participating, their peer group, and also the leader. We were then using pre and post and overtime assessments of the new habits. The line manager was responsible for that, so tracking how their habits were changing. The engagement scores over time of the participants themselves, so that people leader, but also their direct reports, so the teams that they were leading, what's happening with their engagement stats. And then they had an internal system for performance improvement that we were looking to track, that we'll be tracking over time, and comparing the people who have been on the program with other groups of people who have not been on the program for that comparison. And then finally, something that has really worked so brilliantly is building a community of practice within the participant group. And so we wanted to make sure that the progress and the embedment was happening continuously and over time. And so what we asked of them is that they self-create a way that they designed of checking in with each other. And what they decided to do was to meet on a monthly basis in person. that was their choice, that supported their progress and journey. And that was also supported by some just-in-time resources. So I provided things like question prompts, discussion topics and frameworks, an article or video that they might want to use to provoke a conversation or a relevant topic. And what we have found that this community of practice is definitely, the energy is coming from within the group. It's a fantastic way of people for sharing successes, for inspiring their colleagues, for, I didn't even think about doing that in that way, but also about sharing, I'm still struggling with X and Y, or I've got this particular situation and I haven't resolved it yet. Has anybody got any ideas? And so for me, again, that's been such a powerful way of them taking ownership, but also the learning sort of moving exponentially beyond the more formal learning that they've been part of. I hope that's given you a good overview of how that program was designed. And before I go to questions, I just wanted to offer you a gift that I feel might be helpful to you. And this is something that I've designed, which is a diagnostic to help you as L&D professionals understand where performance could be optimized in your organization or your team. And the diagnostic also provides some recommendations. So when you're self-scoring, so it's providing you with some better insight. You can then go to the relevant area and read what the recommendations could be about how you address that or improve in that particular area. If you would like that, I will happily gift it you. You just need to drop me either a DM on LinkedIn, or you can email me at my email address, and I will share that with you. So I'd like to now offer the floor to you, the lovely participants, for your questions, your thoughts for the last 10 minutes or so.
Great. Thank you so much, Karen. There have been already some questions in the chat. I think some of them you already tackled in the meantime, but there's one here that is coming from Lila, I hope I said it right, that says she's curious if the people you work with in the example were resisting, were resisting to this, or were open to this new system, or if you had to work around some resistance or concerns, and if so, how did you manage that?
Really good question. Thank you for it. I think the priming that I was able to do with the strengths assessment and that first coaching session before we ended up with any together group work was a great way of understanding what they needed, what they wanted. So that personal agenda, assuring them that as we would design the intervention, that they were going to get that when they showed up. And also, I think the science part, I have unequivocally found with various audiences, they love it. And so what I did here when I sought feedback after the workshop was there were people who said, I've been on lots of leadership interventions, workshops before, and I wasn't sure that I was going to get any value from this. However, because it was about them personally, and it was a toolkit, a life toolkit, really, personal development toolkit, not just a professional development toolkit. And they could see its relevance. As I said, they were sharing with me, even after day one, they'd gone home and had conversations with their kids. That was completely almost a 180 reversal of how the conversations that they would have had the day before. So it became meaningful and tangible. And that did the convincing. It wasn't me, fortunately, having to convince them, because they had the experience themselves and they saw its relevance and impact. So I think there was probably a continuum in the room. People like, I really need this, I really want this, I hope it's going to be helpful. To people like, I'm on the fence, really, I'm not sure, I've obviously got to go, so I'll come. But I think that first, I guess, we did a 3-day workshop was the key in-person intervention. You've got to get them on the bus within that first 30 minutes. And so if you can do that well, then I think it becomes easier. I think it's also helpful if you work with the more cynical people, and if you can get them to get on board, then there's a bit of peer and social proof going on there that helps build your credibility. Of course, I was coming from the outside. Sometimes that's good because they hope that you're an expert, but sometimes it's like you don't know our business, you don't know our challenges. So, it can work both ways, I think. I hope that answers the question for you.
Okay, we can take that as a yes. For the other ones in the chat, I think in the meantime, Karen has responded, but to any of you still in the call and still with some questions, feel free to jump in.
Hi, I have one question.
Yes.
Great.
So, in the presentation, as you mentioned that, running away from a threat is more important for us, rather than running towards the reward. So how do you implement this practically while designing a solution?
Again, great question. Thank you for asking it. So we want to create we want to minimize the threat response. And so I think, we're often as learning professionals wanting to create this safe environment and build trust. So I think trust has to be on your radar in your design, and also as you kick off some sort of intervention. Sometimes it's helpful to have a vulnerability statement where you're sharing your own experience, even as an expert and being there as a consultant or a learning professional. We've all made mistakes, we've all found things challenging, and I think just sharing some of your own personal story can help on that a little bit. We actually did the neuroscience part after they'd firstly done some, aim setting in the morning of the first day, so that they really understood. And what was wonderful about that, and to your point directly, Madhulika, was they started to use the language that was like, oh, that's just my brain doing its job. And it made me so happy to hear them saying that, because they weren't beating themselves up. And once they understood that these tendencies are designed by our brain to keep us safe and to optimize our energy, it sort of took away the guilt or the shame from it. And so it was sort of affirming for them, I think, and also knowing that they could change, that it was possible, and that they were getting the tools to be able to do that more logically and sustainably. Hope that helps. Great question.
Thank you so much.
Awesome.
That answers my question.
I see we still have 2 hands raised, so let's try to tackle them in the short time. Anna Maria, do you want to jump in?
Yes. Hey, Karen. Thank you for hosting. Hi. In case this was mentioned at the beginning, I joined in a bit later. Feel free to let me know and I'll watch the recording. I was wondering, what was the challenge that the client contacted you for? What was the issue when they reached out? What were they trying to solve? What did they tell you?
It is in the presentation, it is in the slides, Anna-Maria, but I will just remind people. So they had a problem with accountability of people who'd been subject matter experts. They were from the finance and the IT team. They were people managers, not always. Some of them were more experienced than others. So we were working very much to help understand for themselves, well, what do you mean by accountability? So we started to get really nitty-gritty with what are those behaviors, and then what are the habits that you want to embed. So they did a brainstorm and a brain dump around all the things it could be. Then I made them reduce it to 3 that they both had to agree on, the 2 key stakeholders. And then we designed around that once we also knew what the expected impact would be when they were more accountable with these 3 habits.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay.
You're welcome.
Sorry, can I just ask a quick follow-up? Yeah. I just wonder, have you kind of challenged them whether accountability was really the problem to their issue? Because sometimes I know that senior execs come, oh, our managers don't have accountability. And they're like, their roles are unclear, or maybe they're overworked, or maybe the processes are wrong, and it has nothing to do with their own accountability and so much more to do with the things around that. Have you looked at that bit at the beginning?
Yeah, Anna Maria, thank you so much for highlighting that, because there wasn't the time to build it into my slides. But the thing that I guess, is pulling together these jigsaw parts. And what I will commonly have found, whether I'm working as a consultant or whether I've been working in houses, the systems and the processes that already exist, especially around performance management and leadership development in this case, are not designed to be aligned to the behaviors that you now want to move people towards. So it's very common in tech sales organizations that this idea of personal reward is built around individual goals, and those goals are performance related around either revenue generation or whatever. And then they want to build a culture of collaboration. Well, that's not going to happen because people aren't being rewarded financially or recognition terms for that behavior. So thank you so much for highlighting that. It's absolutely part of what I do. Let's look at your existing systems and processes, because we've got to design them in for the change.
Beautiful. Thank you so much. I pass the talking stick to Alok because I see them with the hand up. Alok.
Hi, Alok.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Karen. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, perfectly.
So wanted to quickly check that despite all of these frameworks, that whichever way you showed, is there anything which can also be learned from probably it not working the way you expected it to be? So any learnings from probably weak spots, maybe, if not the failures. In a way, I'm also trying to drive it towards anything that you can tell us to make this really work. Because if that is not checked properly, this might still not have the right outcome.
Yeah, great question, Alec. I think there's one thing as a professional, a sort of practitioner, is we have to have deep humility that whilst we might be there facing up to our client as the expert, or conduit maybe might be a better term to use, if we're not endlessly curious to ask ourselves the question, we come out of, let's say we're running a workshop or facilitating something, we come out of it with a feeling, right? And that feeling is either that was amazing, or that was very good, or I'm not sure what being different. I've sort of got this residual, did it land as well as I hoped? And then you go and sort of seek validation for that, and that's where the happy sheets come in. Happy sheets out the way. We want that more tangible. Okay, so one, we've got to be constantly asking questions, not only of our direct audience, but the ecosystem around that direct audience. So the people who are going to be working, so in this case, my stakeholders, constantly having a really close relationship with them. So they're giving me anecdotal evidence of where there are still challenges, because I'm continually recrafting the solutions, but I don't want to do it in a silo. I want to do it knowing I'm not in the business. I go in where I can. We're fortunate in this particular case that most of the participants are based in the same office, and therefore I can do the coaching in person. So I can pick things up as I walk around, I have that little radar going, and it's constantly asking questions, not only of the people that I know inside the organization, but also, what can I pick up vicariously? So I'm constantly doing that and staying connected. I'm forever humble. I don't profess to know all the answers, to have all the solutions, to be able to create that perfect getting out of the gate. But it's a start point. And I think if we always remember it's a journey, then that journey never ends. And therefore, not that it takes the pressure of us to create a result, but we know that that result is an over time result. The really meaningful result is the over time result. Does that help, Alan?
Fantastic. More than I would have thought of. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
And I would say it's also a perfect closure, Karen, to the session. I know we're already a little bit over time, and there would still be some questions to tackle in the chat. So apologies, everyone, we cannot do that. But as Karen was so open about it, you can definitely reach out to her directly via LinkedIn if you want to get additional insights or just exchange. So from our side, Karen, thank you so much for the session. Thank you to everyone who joined us today, and wishing you all a great rest of the day wherever you are.
Take care, everybody. Have a lovely
Thank you,
evening.
Karen.
Bye.
Sana.